Leafs trade talks are really starting to heat up as a brand new report has dropped revealing a massive Leafs trade update. And as free agency inches closer and closer and reports start to escalate, Brad Living's plan is becoming clearer and clearer. We're going to break down exactly what those new reports are and discuss what this means going forward. A couple of these, and one in particular, has fans fired up. And to break that down as well as a few other things on this episode, folks. But before we get into it all, if you're part of the percentage who aren't subscribed to the channel, you guys have been absolute beasts. Make sure to hit that subscribe button. And thank you guys again for your continued support over here. About 70% of you who are watching right now aren't subscribed to the channel, so make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's a lot to go over today. Obviously, there's been some new reports that have dropped surrounding trade targets. Now, the talk has been surrounding their pending free agents, Mitch Marner, John Tavares, all those different guys. But the Leafs still have some work to do in filling out this team, also on the trade market. And let's dive right into it because it was a pretty interesting, that's a little tidbit right there for one of the players we're going to be talking about, but it's a little bit of a very, intriguing idea now. A few of these players, specifically one in particular we're going to be focusing on. We can see this here, Maple Leafs trade targets, 9 potential center upgrades from big swings to small. We're covering some of them in the video. We'll save some for another video as well here. But let's start with the report here. And it says center, it's a priority. We know that came out from Brad Living last month. It is a priority. Having said that, there are probably 26 other teams that are saying it is a priority that could be addressed in a trade. And I think that looking at the amount of centers that are available, I think a trade makes probably the most sense when it comes to another center. Of course, they could go out and get, some of the other guys that they've been linked to. But regarding a center in particular, let's start with the number one option according to this list. Again, shout out to Jonas Siegel for the list here. According to his rumors, reporting, some informed speculation, things like that, he has Phillip Danault on the Kings as one of his, top targets here. Still a good player on a good contract. In short, the Kings probably have no desire to move him, yet they do have a new GM in Ken Holland, who is unafraid to take big swings, and he would be a very good two-way center. So, Darius, we're going to start with him, and then we'll move on to, one other player. Stay tuned until the end of the video because there's one player in particular that makes the most sense here. But this one's very interesting and one that wouldn't cost a ton in theory, though. It's going to be interesting to see if Ken Holland decides to move on.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see because we've been talking a lot about, John Tavares, Matthew Knies, Mitch Marner leaving. We've been talking a lot about maybe John Tavares not coming back either, and a lot of what's going out from the Toronto Maple Leafs, but not necessarily what's coming in. And I think that this is an interesting idea in regards to Phillip Danault because there's a couple other targets we're going to get to in this video and obviously in future videos. But Danault, I wouldn't say he necessarily excites me, especially at that dollar amount. But I mean, it's an interesting idea. It really is because you have Austin Matthews, who presumably is going to be healthy next season. He said he's going to be ready for training camp. And obviously we know what he can do offensively, right? And he's added that new dimension to his game as well. Now, a lot of things would have to fall into place. A lot of dominoes would have to fall into place for this to make some sense with the Toronto Maple Leafs. But adding Phil Danault onto the team, he's a great defensive center. He completely shut down the Leafs in that playoff series in 2021. He's been doing a good job in LA. He's not that old either. He is 32. So, he's going to get there at some point. But if you take a look at his contract, he doesn't make anything crazy, right? Like just north of $5 million. And he has a couple years left on it too, which is not bad. He has some term. And by the time it's up, he's not going to be that old. So you could still get some pretty good, mileage out of him on the Toronto Maple Leafs as a center. So again, what I mean by dominoes have to fall, what happens with the rest of the lineup? Is John Tavares coming back? You have to figure that out, right? Because then I don't know if it makes too much sense. Or where's John Tavares playing? Is he playing on the wing then? Is Phil Danault in the center? Does that even make sense? I'm not sure, but I think it's an interesting idea because I think the Kings could be open to making a couple trades now because clearly, what they have going on, their formula isn't necessarily working. They keep losing to the Oilers every single year. Please play again, basically. So, I think it could be interesting if the Leafs went out and got a guy like this who's very defensively minded and can shut down guys in the playoffs. So then a guy like Austin Matthews doesn't necessarily have to worry about that. Obviously, you still have to worry about that, but the matchup game wouldn't be as bad in the playoffs for Austin Matthews. So it's an interesting idea, but again, it depends what you're giving up and how you're filling in the rest of the team because you still have to worry about that third line center position as well.
Yeah, I don't think he would cost a lot. Obviously, there'd be some retained salary, you would assume. So at the $5.5 million cap hit, it depends on what. Like at $5.5 million, is he super enticing? I don't think so. But maybe there's some retention there depending on what Nick Robertson's going to be involved in a lot of these as well because he would make a lot of sense for sign and trade and things like that. But let's dive into the one now that makes a lot of sense and has been around for a while, and it is Nazem Kadri, and he's linked in this report again here. A couple of potentially significant complications here. We know Kadri, his age and his big contract. We've had videos discussing him at last year's trade deadline, last year's offseason, all these different things. However, this is the key part, the second part of this paragraph. A reunion certainly has merit for the Leafs. For one thing, Kadri is still an effective player. Scored 35 goals last year, almost similar to John Tavares in the way that they've held up with age. This one makes sense to me. This one I think is possible. I really believe it's possible. Of course, it would take some interesting maneuvers, especially given the cap hit. But if they want a guy who is a very good player and a veteran, it would make sense. However, he's Kadri personality-wise is Tavares' opposite. Feistier in a way that would move the DNA. And we talk about the DNA that wants to be moved, all these different things. While similar in some ways on the ice, personality-wise, very, very different. Their play styles aren't really the same, Tavares and Kadri. But if you bring both of them in, I think they could complement each other fairly well here, especially given they're both in their, approaching their late 30s. They're both still putting up 30 goals a game. This would be very intriguing to me and one that I think a deal would make a ton of sense for.
I think it's an interesting idea, and I think on paper it could definitely make some sense. You can come in and play second line center minutes, or even third line center. If John Tavares goes to the wing or whatever, maybe John Tavares is not coming back. That's the other thing as well. But when you look at this, he's making $7 million for a while still, and he's going to be 35 years old. So I don't really like this one too much, and it's not just because of that. Because those things, I don't think you can win with a young team anyway. Like you got to make some moves to be able to win the Stanley Cup in this window that they have. But the other thing that I don't like in this move is that it's been done before. He was a Toronto Maple Leaf before, and it didn't work out. We know that the league kind of targeted him a little bit as well with the obviously he did some dumb moves in the playoffs, right? He probably should have been suspended, but obviously he was suspended for the rest of that playoff series, which I thought was crazy. So we've been there, done that. The trade at the time that Kyle Dubas made was horrendous. It was a bad trade. They should have never made that trade specifically if they wanted to trade him anyway. So he's the type of guy, we've been talking a lot about Brad Marchand. He's one of those guys. You love to have him on your team, but you hate to play against them. So I would love to have him on the Toronto Maple Leafs for that reason. But I think, again, it's his age. It's the cap hit that he still has for a couple more years. I think the Leafs should be more concerned with finding the next Sam Bennett, Brad Marchand, or Nazem Kadri at this point, not necessarily acquiring these guys. Although I would love Brad Marchand. I think that would be a good deal, but depending on how much he wants to make. But I think it's pretty interesting that they have to go out and find the next guy, I think. And they now have, the guy who's been doing the drafting for the Dallas Stars in the system, Wes Clark, is gone. And if you go back and look at some of the most recent drafts, not too many hits. So now they have the Dallas Stars guy. So that should be pretty interesting. But again, that doesn't make too much sense to me. I think they should be more concerned of finding the next guy who's going to make that impact, not necessarily acquiring him. But again, could make some sense, but I feel like you got to move too many pieces to make that work. And again, not the fastest player, kind of similar to John Tavares. He has won a Stanley Cup, yes, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, obviously there's complications there. I'm a bit more open to it, I think, than you are, simply because he's averaging, you look at here, 34 points in 33 games in his last 3 postseasons. The Leafs haven't had that. But the biggest complication is, of course, the $7 million cap. And now you'd have to make that work, whether there's retention, all those different things are always a factor. And I don't think this is the best move necessarily, but I think it's, for some reason, I think in my head that it's a likely move, especially with either, Brad Treliving wanting to, again, former Flames, ownership. Is there still beef there? That's another complication in this. But I agree with you. I want them to find the next young version of these players. I just don't think that's something that's easily done in this offseason. So that's why I'm thinking that this might be more of a possibility here. I think Kadri is a lot more likely than Phillip Danault, even though, Danault, I just don't think he's probably not going to get traded. Whereas Nazem Kadri, I could see some things working out there and with the history. But let us know down below. Are you on the side of wanting Nazem Kadri? And again, I don't know about wanting him at $7 million. That is a hefty price to pay. But you look at how many years are left on his deal. Basically the amount of years that the Leafs are going to be trying to win a cup, the next 2 to 3 years. So if they make things work and they want to go all in, I want them to be a little bit younger in some ways and better, having Tavares and Kadri both in their mid-30s. I don't know if that's necessarily the right play for the future, but it could be interesting. Also, quickly before I wrap up, let us know out of these players who you would prefer. Danault, Kadri, and also before I wrap up, let us know down below who you would prefer. Danault, Kadri, or the final player we're going to talk on the list now, which is, we'll briefly touch him, Alex Wennberg of the San Jose Sharks. And this would, of course, be a cheaper option in theory. Let's make note of Wennberg only because he shouldn't cost much if the Sharks are open to moving him. Now, when I say cheaper, I'm talking about, I guess, both salary rise at 5, but also the assets it would take to give up for him. The least exciting of the bunch we've talked about, I don't know if this would necessarily move the needle, but I also think the Leafs do need to make some moves that won't necessarily move the needle a ton, but will move it enough to where it'll matter in the playoffs. What are your thoughts on Alex Wenberg of the Sharks? Again, most of these players on this list I actually think would fit well, but it's a matter of picking who fits best. And all of this is ultimately going to come down to what the market is saying. If the Leafs can't find any other option, I could see them making a push for Nazem Kadri just because they need to do some sort of move. But in a perfect world, hopefully, they'll go for someone younger with a bit more pep in their step in their late 20s or something like that.
If Alex Wemberg, he could fit in. Could he fit into the lineup? Absolutely, right? Will he play well with the Leafs? Possibly, right? But this one doesn't make any sense to me because of the type of player that he is and where the Toronto Maple Leafs want to go and everything that Brad Treliving said. We saw Alex Wemberg on the New York Rangers last season when they went to the Eastern Conference Final against the Florida Panthers. And along the way, he didn't do much. He did score a goal against the Florida Panthers, but other than that, he didn't do much and he doesn't play that heavy style. So that does not make any sense for me, even as a third line center. I feel like you can find a better option there. So you get what you pay for, right? So yes, like you said, like it's a cheaper option, but you're not going to get as good of a player and a player that doesn't play the style that the Toronto Maple Leafs need to play, right? When it really matters. So this one doesn't make, especially if it's a trade, doesn't really make too much sense for me. But some of the other ones, even Kadri, I'd be more open to Kadri than this one, I think. But to me, Phillip Danault probably not getting traded could make some sense, but obviously we're going to cover a couple other targets. And something that they should look into is dipping into the free agent market when that opens up on July 1st in terms of finding a center or what they want to do. They need to make a decision on John Tavares, first of all.
Yeah, I don't think. I agree with you on this one. Our first fully agreed player here doesn't raise the ceiling at all and won't really change much, I don't think, for this team. But again, he would give you some more reliable minutes, I guess, compared to Domi, maybe, and Pontus Holmberg, like Siegel suggests. But let's not blow out of all these who you prefer, who you don't. And do you want to see Nazem Kadri in a Leafs jersey? Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you later.